So today's webinar is entitled Disentangling Environmental and Human Drivers of Carbon Dioxide Uptake and Release on Land, and it will be provided by Dr Vanessa Haverd from CSIRO. Vanessa is a model developer within the Australian and Global Carbon Assessment Team in the Access Group of CSIRO Climate Science Centre, and she's the Deputy Chief Investigator of the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub Project 5.6, entitled The Carbon Budget of Continental Australia and Possible Future Trajectories. Vanessa has 13 years of experience as carbon cycle assessment that integrates modelling with observations for the Australian continent and the globe. So I'll pass straight over to Vanessa to get started on your presentation. Thanks, Vanessa.
Okay, thanks, Sonia, and good morning, everyone. Okay, so thanks for the nice introduction. I'm going to be presenting some snapshots from the last few years of work in the team, really aimed at developing and deploying tools to better understand the processes that sequester and release carbon on land, and particularly what's behind the net land carbon sink. So Sonia gave me a heads up that some people leave early, so here I've put my key messages up front. So why do we care about the global land carbon sink? Well, it's equivalent to more than a quarter of anthropogenic emissions in the present day. It's how does it arise? Well, we understand it's being driven by a rapid increase in photosynthesis, and that this on land, and that this has been caused by a larger than expected carbon dioxide fertilisation effect. And we also know that the sink's strength of regrowing forests is contributing strongly to carbon uptake on land, and is comparable to the total amount of carbon taken up by old growth forests. I'm also going to touch on some aspects of the Australian land carbon sink, and particularly look at some aspects of how extreme climate is affecting the sink, and I'll particularly be looking at heat extremes, big rainfall events, and fire. Touch on those three. Okay, so let's start with a bit of context. This slide from the Global Carbon Project shows the airborne fraction. The airborne fraction is a really important quantity because it quantifies how much of what fraction of the anthropogenic emissions remain in the atmosphere. And what's really interesting about this quantity is that really there's no significant trend in it since 1960. So that means that together the ocean and land carbon sinks are taking up a constant proportion of anthropogenic emissions. So with a bit further breakdown now, we, within the Global Carbon Project, we quantify the sources and sinks every year, and this is a snapshot of the fate of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions for the last decade, 2009 to 2018. There we can see that of the total sources, 86% were from fossil fuels and cement emissions, 14% from land use change, and those sources are then partitioned into sinks, with 44% ending up in the atmosphere, 29% in vegetation and soils, and 23% in the ocean. And that 4% imbalance just represents our uncertainty in quantifying those terms. So another way of looking, so that's a recent snapshot, the last over a decade, but it's also interesting to look at the partitioning of the carbon budget since 1850. And I won't go through this figure in detail, but it's a nice way of showing how we've gone from 286 ppm in 1850 to 407 parts per million in the present day. And I just want to highlight that the land is responsible for really large terms in that difference. So the land use change itself is very similar to the emissions from land use change are very similar to the emissions we've had from coal combustion, and the land sink has taken up almost as much as what's been emitted from land use change. So these are really large terms in the carbon budget, and it's important that we understand how they arise so that we can have some confidence in projecting what might happen in the future. So this figure is another way of a way of showing the dynamics that were represented in the previous slide. So again, looking at the sources of CO2 to the atmosphere on the top of the graph and the sinks on the bottom. And I want to point out here that the sinks in green are now estimated here using an ensemble of land carbon terrestrial biosphere models. That's known as the TRENDY ensemble. There's about 16 models, and I'm going to be talking in a bit more detail about one of those models in particular. There's a bit of a mismatch between the actual sink and there's a bit of a mismatch between the sources and sinks. That's what this grey shaded area is, and that again is representing that imbalance that we don't quite understand. Okay, so as I said, the land carbon sink itself within the framework of the global carbon budget is now quantified using an ensemble of terrestrial biosphere models. So every year the global carbon budget creates an update to its assessment, and every year this group of modelers frantically generates simulations using the most up-to-date forcing, land use forcing and meteorological forcing to estimate the land carbon sink and the terms that contribute to it. And for the past 4 years, we've been contributing to that effort with the cable land surface model extended here to a form we now call cable POP, with some additional functionality that makes it particularly suitable for land carbon cycle attribution. So I won't go through this in detail, but it's just a schematic which is supposed to give you a flavour for the sort of processes we represent. So we represent the natural ecosystems, also abandoned farmland regenerating to forest. We represent pasture and cropland, managed forest, wood harvest, etc. And the new elements in the model compared to the standard land model you may or may not be familiar with are these POP and POP-LUC modules. So, and that'll be important because one of the key developments has been this land use change capability that interfaces with this woody demography module. And the importance of representing woody demography is that the rate of carbon accumulation in forests is very dependent on the age structure of the forest. And that's true for natural disturbances, for example, fire, as well as for human-induced disturbances, such as land use change events. Okay, so as I've mentioned, we contribute every year to this ensemble of terrestrial biosphere models informing the global carbon budget. On the left there is the land carbon sink estimated by the ensemble. The dark line there is the multi-model mean, and the thin green lines are the individual models. On the right, we just show what's now a standard component of this analysis, which is the benchmarking of these models against observational data, and just showing the representation of our model cable POP in the leftmost column there. You just focus on the right-hand grid. The green colours represent a relatively good performance. So on the whole, we're performing well within the ensemble. Okay, so now I'm going to break down the land carbon sink in a bit more detail. So this figure here shows the breakdown of the global land carbon sink, but with the capability we have, we could produce this sort of analysis for any region of the globe. So again, similar to the global carbon budget figure, on the below the zero line, we have sinks, and above the zero line, we have sources. In this case, our sink is predominantly this environmentally induced sink in the dark green patch. And that's largely the effect of CO2 fertilisation on land, but also climate change, and particularly lengthening of growing season in the Northern Hemisphere at high latitudes. But in addition to that environmentally induced sink, we also have an anthropogenically induced sink, which is secondary forest regrowth. And that itself can be broken down into regrowth on abandoned farmland that's not shifting cultivation, regrowth on farmland that is undergoing shifting cultivation, and regrowth in forests that have remained forests. So in other words, regrowth after a harvest event. And then on the source side, we have source terms from wood harvest and clearing, and also from management of pastures and croplands. And then we also have this so-called loss of additional sink capacity, and that's the carbon flux. That's the magnitude of the sink that we have lost because we've cleared land. And then the net result of that is this red line, which is the net land carbon sink. The solid black line is the net land use change. Okay, so in what follows, I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at two components of this breakdown. First, the environmentally induced component of the sink, or the natural sink, and secondly, the secondary forest regrowth term. So in work we've recently published, we've looked at one of the key components of the natural land carbon sink. So the natural land carbon sink arises because the gross uptake of carbon must be larger than the release of carbon. The gross uptake of carbon is done by photosynthesis. The release is from processes such as heterotrophic respiration, autotrophic respiration, and also fire. So in order to have a sink of the magnitude that we're observing, we must have gross uptake that is in excess of the release. And moreover, the sink is growing, and therefore the gross uptake, the difference between those two terms must be increasing. So that tells us we have a fast growing rate of global photosynthesis. And in this particular work, we used observations to constrain the partitioning of that increase. So the little figure you see here shows the increase in global photosynthesis since 1900. And that's broken down here into three components. First, the direct carbon dioxide fertilisation effect. So that's the stimulation of photosynthesis at the leaf level by increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Secondly, the increased leaf area. And thirdly, the growing season change, or the effect of climate. So just stepping back a bit, there are multiple lines of evidence to suggest that terrestrial biosphere activity is increasing on land. And in this slide, we simply see the rise in CO2 concentration in the purple, and the inferred change in global photosynthesis since 1900 from a tracer called carbonyl sulfide. And that can be used to infer the change in photosynthesis or gross primary production, because it enters the stomata of the leaves in the same way that carbon dioxide does. Okay, another marker of increasing terrestrial biospheric activity is that the amplitude, or the amplitude of the seasonal cycle of northern hemispheric carbon dioxide has increased by over 50% since 1960. That's what's shown in these plots here. So these are the black and purple lines are interpolation of aircraft data from two separate campaigns, one in the late 1950s and the other around 2009, and showing very distinctly that the amplitude is increasing. And that can also be seen in the lower sort of plot, where the amplitude is plotted as a function of latitude. So this has been the subject of quite a bit of research, and I'm not going to go into it in detail here. Suffice to say that the current generation of, or the earlier generation,
I don't know. Maybe
Earth system models can't capture the magnitude of that increase. And possible explanations that have been put forward for the observed trend are CO2 fertilisation, high latitude warming effects on biome distribution and plant productivity, and agricultural intensification. And finally, and this is a different type of constraint on terrestrial biospheric activity, we have leaf level data supporting this so-called coordination hypothesis, which is that plants optimize productivity in their environment by relative nitrogen investment in electron transport and Rubisco-limited steps in the photosynthesis chain. That might seem completely irrelevant, but it turns out to be important because these two potentially rate-limiting steps have very different sensitivities to the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the simulated CO2 fertilisation effect in our models will depend very much on the relative contributions of those two rates to total photosynthesis. Okay, so now going back to our plot with the rise in CO2 and the change in global photosynthesis that's based on the carbonyl sulfide tracer, we now overlay some model estimates. And so the grey lines represent the global photosynthesis trajectories since 1900 from 14 different terrestrial biosphere models, those same models that inform the global carbon budget every year. And what's a bit concerning, I suppose, is the divergence amongst those models, but also that on average, the increase is a lot lower than the observation-based estimate. So the models are simulating 19 plus or minus 12%, and the observations indicating a 31% increase. Okay, so now just summarising the constraints we've used to get to the result that the CO2 fertilisation effect is higher than we previously thought. So we looked just a couple of slides back at the constraint imposed by coordination. We've now implemented that mechanism into our current version of cable so that it reproduces the leaf level observations from Mayer et al, supporting that hypothesis. With the same version of the model, we can also replicate the observation-based increase in global photosynthesis. We can also simulate or at least get close to simulating the change in amplitude, seasonal amplitude in the Northern Hemisphere. And we have a good replication of the interannual variations in the net land carbon sink and the trend of that sink since 1960. The interannual variations, by the way, are actually a good indicator of a model's climate sensitivity. So there's been work to show that that those interannual variations in the land carbon sink are strongly related to precipitation and temperature variations, particularly in tropical latitudes. Okay, so another thing we can look at with the models is what the global land photosynthesis increase would be if the only driver of that was CO2. And that's what this plot shows. So in this model experiment, we've turned off variations in other drivers, such as temperature and precipitation. And so all you see is the result of carbon dioxide going up. And interestingly, although the TRENDY ensemble gave very divergent simulations of the global increase in photosynthesis, when you look at this experiment, they give a much more uniform result, although much lower than the result that we get with cable that utilises the available constraints. Okay, so with that model that satisfies the available constraints, we're able to partition the large increase in global photosynthesis between a leaf level component, a greening component, which is largely a secondary effect of carbon dioxide fertilisation. So if the plants are stimulated to grow more by additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they have more carbon to invest in leaves, and that results in a greater leaf area and in the manner of compound interest, additional photosynthesis. The climate effect is mostly to do with lengthening of growing season. So on the global scale, the leaf level CO2 fertilisation effect dominates the global photosynthesis increase, but that's not true everywhere. So I've circled here the semi-arid regions of the world. So if you just focus on the black solid line and the black dotted line, the black dotted line shows you the leaf level carbon dioxide fertilisation effect, and the black solid line, the total. And so that the difference between those is the greening. And that's in stark contrast to, say, tropical forests, where the entire increase is attributable to the direct leaf level effect. Interestingly, there are other studies that support these numbers. So for the semi-arid greening in recent decades, there are observation-based estimates using remote sense foliage cover that indicate an 11% greening over that period, and our simulations simulate 10%, so they're in very good agreement. And in contrast, in tropical forests, where you have almost no greening, there's a 12% increase in the leaf level component, and that's replicated in our modelling. Okay, so finally you might ask, well, where is all this photosynthesis increase occurring? And the map in the top left shows the spatial distribution of the photosynthesis trend since 1980. No surprise there that the higher trends are occurring in warm areas because the CO2 sensitivity is higher there, but also in areas that are relatively productive. If we look over on the right, we see a attribution of that trend. So the total being broken down between carbon dioxide, temperature, carbon dioxide and temperature interaction, precipitation and land use change. And you can see that overwhelmingly our simulations indicate a trend that's driven by carbon dioxide. Just for contrast, I illustrate our attribution of the net land sink over the same period. Of course, this is just one model's attribution of that, and it's not as certain as the photosynthesis trend. But still, it's interesting to see that once you go from the gross fluxes to the net land sink, things get a lot more complicated, but still we have a large component of CO2 fertilisation responsible for the sink. The spatial pattern looks quite different to the GPP trend, and that's in large part because at higher latitudes, while we might not have such a high GPP trend, the sink strength tends to be fairly high because the turnover or the release processes for carbon are slower there because it's colder. Okay, so now I'm going to move from the environmentally driven sink component to the role of forest regrowth. Just quickly touch on that. So this is a study that we were involved in, which reconstructed the age distribution of forests around the world, and then looked at the relative roles of old growth and regrowth forests in contributing to the land carbon sink. And what we found is that old growth forests, well, first of all, old growth forests as they were defined here, which are forests that are greater than 140 years old, occupy a smaller area than the regrowth forests. But on a unit area basis, the uptake rate is very similar between old growth and regrowth forests. There's a few reasons behind that. So the green bar here is partitioned into a light green and a dark green component. The dark green component represents the regrowth the regrowth sink you would have in the absence of environmental change. So that's occurring because young forests, having not yet reached maturity, have a lower rate of mortality than old growth forests, and so are accruing carbon more quickly. That's a tree demographic effect. On top of that, those forests are also exposed to environmental change, and so what this study estimated was that the environmental change component was actually bigger than the demographic component, although both were significant. Taking into account the similar sink strengths per unit area of old growth versus regrowth forests and the larger forest area of regrowth forests, in the end, the regrowth forests contribute more uptake per year to the land carbon sink than the old growth forests. And that's really emphasising, I suppose, that even regrowing forests, so not pristine forests, are contributing strongly to land carbon uptake and should be protected. All right, so now I'm going to change tack a bit and move more into the Australian context and touch on a few aspects of how the Australian land carbon sink responds or might respond to extreme climate variations. So I'll start with a couple of hypotheses. So what you see here is what we've coined the S-curve, which is a schematic representation of gross primary production or photosynthesis as a function of rainfall. And we expect that rainfall anomalies will affect semi-arid or dry ecosystems in opposite ways to mesic or wet ecosystems. For the semi-arid ecosystems, we hypothesize that the boom episodes may be larger and affect long-term biospheric productivity more than bust episodes. In other words, we expect in terms of carbon uptake, we expect the big wets to be bigger than the big dries. But, and as a consequence, As a consequence, a future more variable climate may be expected to lead to an increase in semi-arid ecosystem productivity, even if the mean rainfall doesn't change. But of course, the opposite would be expected for the mesic ecosystems, where the vegetation would tend to be more drought sensitive. In those cases, we would expect the big dries to be bigger than the big wets. In other words, a large rainfall deficit would be expected to cause more carbon release than a big wet event. Okay, so we studied this at the global scale in a bit of detail a couple of years back now, and quantified this so-called asymmetry in productivity, and found that Australia was actually indeed a global hotspot for this asymmetry in gross primary production. And that's actually a consequence of partly at least a consequence of the rainfall variability in Australia. So Australia is also a hotspot for rainfall interannual variability. Okay, so just a bit of background now. So this is some earlier work we did quantifying the spatial distribution of plant productivity across the continent, plant biomass and soil carbon stocks. And in large part, these are not correlated, certainly related to annual rainfall, and substantial amounts of carbon are held in soil and litter. So I guess that means that in studying the continent, we have to be aware that those extreme, the asymmetry to extremes that I was talking about before will play out very differently in the semi-arid regions compared to the tropics and temperate regions. And both are important, and you can see that here looking at this summary of the continental carbon stocks. So although on a unit area basis, the semi-arid regions and savanna regions are less productive, because of their very large areas, they still contain large proportions of the continental biomass. So for example, the cool temperate regions, even though they're so carbon dense, contain less carbon than the sparser savanna regions when aggregated up by area. So in the current work, we're assessing the vulnerability of Australians' carbon stocks, and in contrast to the global work that I was explaining earlier, we're using a lot of regional observations, and I'm just showing you there a snapshot of the different types of observations and their locations, which we use to constrain our estimates. So I'm now going to move on to some examples to illustrate that the effect of extremes in shaping the structure and function of Australian ecosystems. I'll start with extreme heat and then touch on fire and extreme rainfall. Okay, so in many Australian woodland and forest ecosystems, photosynthesis and evapotranspiration can apparently become decoupled, i.e. evapotranspiration continues, but productivity may drop off under extreme heat conditions. This was suggested to be somewhat of a puzzle in the literature. So we looked into it in some detail and found that yes, indeed, at many flux sites across Australia, and I'll show you some more results in a minute, under extreme heat conditions, transpiration continues virtually unabated, whereas productivity can drop off a little. But we were able to explain that result using the standard coupled photosynthesis tomatal conductance model within cable. So what you see here is an example for the Gingin flux site in Western Australia. The blue there represents the so-called median conditions. So this is the median conditions for December, January and February. And the red lines represent the 90th percentile conditions, i.e. the days where the daily maximum air temperature exceeded the 90th percentile. And similar for, so in this particular instance, the daytime peak was around 28 degrees on a median summer day, and closer to 36 on an extreme day. And the vapor pressure deficit was also particularly high on the extremes. This led to a decline in stomatal conductance during the extreme days, but that decline was not enough to cause a reduction in total evaporation. So transpiration remained high, although there was some drop-off of gross primary production. So how does that play out across a range of flux sites across Australia? So what I show here is a bar chart illustrating the ratio of the extreme quantity to the median quantity for both evaporation and gross primary production. And what's quite remarkable is that across all these sites, ranging from wet savanna to dry savanna, cool temperate, through to Mediterranean sites, the transpiration continues unabated under extreme heat conditions, with a small, possibly a small decline in gross primary production. What that means from a climate point of view is that under these extreme heat conditions, the trees are actually providing a negative feedback, to the climate. Okay, I'll just say a few words about fire. So, as we know, fire weather conditions are worsening, particularly in the south and southeast. This is a map of the Forest Fire Danger Index trend. And that's important for carbon balance, because under a regime of fixed fire frequency, we would expect fire to contribute, net fire emissions to contribute negligibly to the overall carbon balance of the continent. But if the fire regime is changing such that fires are becoming more frequent or more intense, then we can expect fires to become a significant source of carbon to the atmosphere. So this is some preliminary modelling we've done, looking at the magnitude of fire emissions from different regions of the continent, so aggregated up over these different regions. And what we find is that by far the biggest fluxes, I guess it's no surprise, are coming from the cool temperate forests when they burn. So the area burnt each year of the savanna and the tropics is much larger, but when the cool temperate forests burn, they emit much more carbon to the atmosphere. And the different colours in the diagrams represent the different fuel sources contributing to the direct emissions, and those temperate fires are actually dominated by emissions from the live wood pool. Okay, so that's all well and good, but I guess what we're really interested in is what happens when you simulate the recovery from such fire events. We're in the process of doing those simulations, but we have some earlier work looking at a similar problem. So what we'd like to know is how fire is affecting the carbon balance in time, and how much that is perturbing carbon stocks compared to, for example, drought or water limitation. In separate work, we've looked at that question from a spatial point of view. So we've looked at a gradient of fire frequencies and a gradient of aridity across the Northern Australian tropical transect, and coupled our demography model to the fire inputs and to the to assess how much how the effects of water limitation versus fire affect the vegetation structure. So this is exactly the same problem in space as we would like to explore in time. And in this particular case, what we saw was when we looked at regions of different rainfall amount going south along the Northern Australian tropical transect from Darwin down to Tennant Creek, we found that we could attribute 32% of the biomass loss in a given year, in an average year, to fire disturbance at the northern end of the transect, where the fires are more frequent, and only 16% to fire disturbance at the southern end, with the balance being of turnover due to resource limitation mortality. And with those simulations, we were able to correctly simulate the tree grass variation along that transect in response. And those predictions emerged from complex feedbacks between the plant physiology and the vegetation dynamics, mediated by shifting resource allocation to above and below ground components. Okay, but of course we haven't explored, we haven't yet explored the carbon losses from the current fire season. We know already that 500 megatons have been lost from temperate forests, and we are hypothesizing that the regrowth from these fires may not match the lost carbon. But to assess this quantitatively, we need modelling functionality which correctly simulates the recovery dynamics after the fire, which is what we're working towards. And finally, I'll touch on wet extremes. So if you cast your minds back to 2010-11, we had a massive amount of rainfall over Australia. It was so much it caused the sea level to drop by 5 millimetres. And we contributed to the global discussion, looking at the magnitude of that anomaly and how it arose. And in particular, so on the right-hand side, you can see our own modelling of the net ecosystem productivity time series, showing the massive positive excursion in 2010 and 2011. And when we isolate the semi-arid regions of Australia and plot the NEP anomaly against the precipitation anomaly, you can see that 2011 was really a massive outlier. And indeed, of the 1.5 petagrams of carbon global anomaly in 2011, Australia contributed 0.4. So that was really quite extraordinary. But the question is, one question around that is whether that carbon that was whether that carbon that was taken up in that big wet event was actually maintained in the ecosystems. And our preliminary modelling suggests that that it was. So what you see here are our most recent estimates of the cumulative net biospheric production of the Australian continent on the top, and then isolating the savanna region, where a lot of the action occurred during that big wet anomaly. You can see the big positive excursion around 2011, but interestingly, after 2011, that doesn't drop off, suggesting that there, at least according to these preliminary results, there wasn't a big bust or a big loss of carbon in the wake of that event. So that's all I want to say about the extreme wet events, I think. That basically the asymmetric rainfall response and the retention ability of the savannas and semi-arid ecosystems may mean that the boom episodes are larger than the bust episodes, and a future more variable climate may be expected to lead to an increase in semi-arid ecosystem productivity, even if the mean rainfall does not change. But of course, the reverse is true for the high carbon density temperate forests, and we should be very concerned about that. Thank you.
Fabulous, great. Thanks, Vanessa, for a really informative and detailed webinar. So just a reminder to everyone, if you've got some questions for Vanessa, pop them in the chat box there. We've got a few coming in. I might start with one of the more general questions, Vanessa, that was just after a bit more of explanation of what the difference between a carbon stock and sink is. Could you just go into that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, sure. Sorry if I was confusing about that. A carbon stock is a store of carbon. So that might be, for example, the carbon stored in the soil or the carbon stored in tree trunks. And what was the other word? The
sink.
The sink. The sink is a rate of storage. So the sink is how much carbon is taken up, for example, per year. So the sink is a flux, and the store is an amount.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks just for confirming that. And then Rob asks, regarding the distribution of carbon sinks, what does this mean in terms of opportunities for carbon farming? Are particular biogeographic regions better candidates for increasing carbon in the landscape?
Well, the answer is yes. Certainly higher productivity areas would be more profitable for carbon farming, but the problem is that they're also more profitable for agriculture. So the availability of land for carbon farming, the distribution of available land tends to be strongly towards the climates that don't, or the biogeography that doesn't support higher sequestration rates. My understanding.
Okay. And another quick question that actually coming from me, I just want to confirm, in one of the earlier slides you showed, I think that the net carbon sink was decreasing globally?
No, it's increasing.
So the net sink is increasing?
Yes.
Yeah, so that means, does that mean then that the land system can play quite an important role in mitigating emissions globally, like under the Paris Agreement targets?
Yes, I don't know if you can see my slides there, but the top left there shows the evolution of the land sink. So at the moment, yes, it's increasing. It means that what it really means is that natural ecosystems are providing an incredible ecosystem service to us by taking up this carbon, and that we really need to be protecting them and mindful that they are, they're slowing the pace of climate change. It doesn't mean there's some sort of magic bullet that gets us out of jail. It just means that we have to, hold off from more land clearing, that we need to be protecting the forests and the ecosystems that are doing such a great job for us.
Yeah, absolutely, thanks. And Sarah says, thinking about the past summer of drought and fire, would you expect that the drought was more damaging for carbon sinks than the fire, or is it more of a cumulative effect?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting research question to answer. I'm sure we're not the only ones who are going to be looking into it. I think I'm not sure that we know yet. Just as an observer looking around the landscape, I think a lot of, similar to other people, I think I've seen that there are an awful lot of woodlands out there that look like they've been fire affected because they've suffered so much from the drought. So it's yeah, I think it's going to be another model data fusion exercise really to answer that question. Yeah, I think they're both going to be highly significant. But just to be clear, in a normal year, fire emissions don't affect the land carbon uptake significantly. So we've done simulations with and without a prognostic fire module turned on, and it barely affects the land carbon balance at the continental scale. But that didn't go up to the horror fire season we've just had. So it would be very interesting to see how this current fire season is going to change that.
Fabulous, thank you. All right, just last chance for everyone to write questions in the Zoom chat box. But just while we're waiting to see if we've got any more questions coming in, I guess I'll just give a little bit of a plug for the next month's Earth Systems and Climate Change Science webinar, which will be held on the Wednesday the 18th of March from 11:30 to 12:30. And that's going to be looking at the impacts of climate change and climate variability on surface ocean waves. And it will be presented as a team this time for the first time, and we'll be having two presenters from the Hub's Marine and Coastal Climate Services project, Joa Moram from Griffith University, who is a Hub PhD affiliate, and Dr. Andrew Marshall from the Bureau of Meteorology. So as usual, more information and registration details on that will be sent out closer to the date. But seeing as we've got no more questions coming in for Vanessa, I just want to thank Vanessa for a fantastic webinar, and also thank everyone attending for your time and for the questions that you've sent in. If you do have any questions or inquiries about today's webinar, please get in touch with the Hub, either through myself or through the website. And apart from that, thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. So thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, everyone.